Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As many of you have joined us over the years, we like to share stories about what people are doing and how they contribute and what they learn and grow from as they do so. Back during the early turn of the century, we realized that a lot of us could read from authors who had written beautiful stories and literature that had actually shaped our lives or that we felt were actually talking about our lives as well. On the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who experienced that very thing. She had the opportunity to work for a literary office in New York, and that was pretty much her first job as I understand, but what she didn't know is that she would soon become sort of an assistant serving J.D. Salinger. Most people would remember him as he's also a group of people such as F. Scott Fitzgerald, Faulkner, and the like. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of the book, My Salinger Year, and I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program our guest, Joanna Rakoff. Joanna, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you for having me.
Boy, what a lot of fun going into New York and experiencing your first winter.
Yes, I am. I moved to New York as a grown-up at 23, and right after I arrived was kind of the biggest blizzard in 3 decades that completely shut the city down, and I was completely unprepared. I had been living in London where there's not a lot of snow, and I didn't have any money, and I didn't even own a pair of snow boots or a down coat or anything, and oh God, yes, it was a little ridiculous.
I think what's really interesting about your story, too, is you realize, this is sort of like your first job. You're out there trying to make your way in the world, and of all places you decide New York, home of the $10 sandwich, the $5 lousy cup of coffee, and maybe barely minimum wage, who knows. But that certainly is a way that makes people shaped and hungry about what it is they want to do.
Yes. I mean, well, the thing is that I think people have different relationships with New York City depending on where they're from. And so for me, I grew up on the outskirts, the sort of exurbs, or the countryside outside of New York. Not really the true suburbs, a little beyond, more kind of the Hudson River Valley. But my family was very much rooted in New York. Both my parents had grown up in New York. My grandmother, all my great aunts and uncles, my whole extended family was still in Manhattan, a few in Queens and the Bronx. And so for me, New York was the city. And, I'd spent enormous amounts of time there as a child, as a teenager. I went to plays all the time with my father, who was a former actor. We ate there all the time. And I would go to other cities. I traveled a lot as a kid, and until I went to London, they didn't seem like actual cities to me, because I would think people drive here. That's not a city. Like Portland, that's not a city. That's a town, And no, it's only New York, and I suppose London felt like real cities to me. And so I couldn't really. Part of the reason I went there at 23 was because I couldn't quite imagine life anywhere else. I wasn't going to move back to this kind of country town in which I'd grown up, but I had almost moved to Berkeley, and it didn't feel like a city to me, and I wanted to be in a city, which meant New York. I know that as I was reading your memoir here, as I kept thinking of that movie Bright Lights, Big Cities, starring Michael J. Fox. Are you familiar with that? I've read the book. It's based on a novel by Jay McInerney, which is a truly fantastic novel. It's one of my favorites. But I have not seen the movie.
Yeah, because it was one of those where you were kind of describing, here's somebody, getting along, trying to absorb into the culture that you're, now hired into. And, sometimes the struggles that go along with just kind of finding your way in your place. A lot of times when we get started in something new, something fresh, something that we feel it's ours. We make our own way, where we make or we break sort of a thing. And so you try to find a way to vibrate and fit in while still trying to take a lead with your life. Did you find those kinds of things really occurring?
Yes, I suppose. As I said, I kind of moved to New York by happenstance, sort of by it was almost inertia. just to sort of step back a little bit, I think I have so many friends. New York is such a sort of, to be really cheesy about it, like a kind of city of big dreams, where people from other parts of the country kind of fantasize about moving to New York and finding their way in different kind of glamorous professions. And all the more so now than when I was a kid. I think that, first of all, the city, is kind of cleaned up and safer. I was a child in the late 70s and 80s, and it was quite dangerous then. And our neighbors in the country thought we were crazy for spending so much time there. But so when you and New York also just kind of exists in the popular imagination, like because of Sex and the City and all these things, in a way that it didn't girls before. And so I have friends who moved to New York from other places, and they were much more aware of the things that you're pointing out, like, oh, it's really expensive, it's really a struggle, and you have to kind of fight your way. And I wasn't. Like, New York was just kind of the fabric of my identity. And so I moved there, and these things that you're mentioning, I wasn't quite conscious of them. I just was kind of conscious of just forging a normal life for myself. And so a normal life for me, from what I was kind of, something in New York having to do with literature. And that just was what felt like an inevitable outcome to me.
Now, if you could, describe for our listeners the difference between a literary agency and a publisher.
Oh, right. So this is a distinction that, I did not know when I took this job. So I, just for our listeners, I'll explain that I sort of fell into this job at a literary agency when I was 23. I had just dropped out of grad school and knew that I wanted to do something literary but didn't know what. And a headhunter, there was a placement agency for the publishing industry that I was sent to, and I didn't even really know what that was either. And the headhunter said to me, how would you feel about working for a literary agency or an agent rather than an editor? And I said, sure, but I had no idea what that meant. So I sort of vaguely understood what a publisher was. And anyway, so for all of you, here's the distinction. A literary agent is a person who represents a writer's career, essentially, represents a writer.
Okay.
So I'm a writer, and I have an agent, and when depending on what I do, let's say I'm a fiction writer, which I am. My first book was a novel. My new book that I'm hopefully finishing up soon is a novel. So I'm a fiction writer. So I, unless I'm super, super famous like Stephen King, I write a novel, I give it to my agent. My agent will usually, if he or she is a good agent, will send me back edits. I'll make those changes. We'll go back and forth for a while, and then my agent will do what's known as sending it out. We'll send out the manuscript, send out that novel to editors at a publishing house. And hopefully, in a good world, one of them buys it, or many of them bid on it, and you have what's known as an auction, and then the publisher publishes it. So basically, an agent is the person who is kind of your go-between with the publisher, and their job is to represent your interests and make sure that you are not necessarily taken advantage of, make sure that you're protected in all ways, and in all different ways. So financially, of course, most writers at this point are represented by agents, but those who are not, tend to sort of take it smaller advances for their books. But an agent, will sort of go over your contracts. That's a lot of what an agent does. There's kind of a lawyerly aspect to being an agent, making sure that you're getting the right amount of royalties for things, that you have approval over things you should have approval for, that everything is in its place. But they also will sort of fight for you in different ways. If they feel like a publisher has forgotten about your book or isn't doing the best job publishing it, they'll really step in and help you. If they're good agents, they will. And then a publisher is a publishing house. That's the entity that actually makes the book and puts it out and oversees every aspect of production of it. So so if you're being published by a major publisher, you have a publicist who is the person sending out what's known as galleys, advance copies of your book to magazines and TV shows and radio shows and what have you, and they're booking you interviews and making sure that reviews are coming out in places, and they're, in some cases, they're sending you on a tour and just doing stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And you have marketing people, and then the publisher has their sales force, which is all over the country, and they work with bookstores to try to sort of talk to booksellers about your book, and they're extremely powerful, actually, and also just helpful and great. Mm-hmm. And then you have your editor, who actually works with you on the actual text of the book, and oversees other aspects of it too. But their primary role is kind of helping you make the book the best it can be, and then figuring out with this team of other people how to get that book out into the world.
So in a nutshell, for the listeners out there, this is some of what it takes to make a book like Harry Potter prominent.
Yes, or any book, yes.
No, it was sort of a tongue-in-cheek joke being on this end where I get these books, and it was interesting when I started in radio more than 15 years ago that at first it was like being in a playground candy store. I was getting all these things sent to me, and there were specific areas of interest that I had that, I began to slowly get infiltrated more than others, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is neat. But then I began to discover, especially media, that when you come to the other side of the mirror, that this is more prominent than people who don't work on this side see. That it's just constant. Like you said, you were describing a lot of my day, on the telephone talking with publicists. Here's a show idea, or here's a book idea, here's something you might want to think about. And you hear this constantly, and it's fascinating to think about what that world really is. I think it would be really interesting to actually experience a movie that would show something like that, how it really works, so people would get a better feel that when you're watching the evening news, for instance, or one of them Nightline news programs, look at how much of it really is about a story somebody's trying to suggest that the public should buy into, rather than actual news. And it's really interesting stuff. Mm. And we leave a writer breathless.
Yes, I'm afraid I don't watch the evening news. I don't even have a TV, so I don't know that much about that.
No, I'm just saying from my side. From your side, it's more of a writer. Now, what I really got a kick out of, because it reminded me of my first days taking typing, is first of all, you really weren't as fluent in typing as you told your boss were when you first started, and you were more used to the electronic age, and that this was an office that really seemed to be of the 1940s, so to speak, still operated with that kind of machinery. Tell us about that.
Right. So as I said, I was working with this policeman agent, and she called me, and this is right before Christmas, and I had been told by her, we'll find a job for you, but after the new year, there are no one. I'm not sending anyone out on interviews now. There's nothing. It's because it's the day before everyone's about to leave on Christmas break. And then she called me back and said, wait, I have something for you. I've been trying to place someone with this person for months now, and she's not taking anyone I'm sending her. She really needs an assistant. She's an agent. You need, when you go into the interview, she also said she's a little bit difficult, and I said, okay, I can handle that. And but she said, she didn't explain why, and she said, when you go into the interview, it's very important that you tell her that you can type. And I said, essentially, I can't really type. And she said, it doesn't matter, no one of your generation can type. You grew up with computers, no one can type. Don't worry about it. Have you ever typed? And I explained that in middle school, I grew up in New York State, and in middle school, all New York State kids are required to pass typing. And so I said, I used to be able to type, and I had a typewriter, but then I got a computer, and I just kind of forgot how. And she said, it's like riding a bicycle. Don't worry about it. Just tell her that you can type. Once we get you in there, you'll get the job. You'll be up to speed in a day or two. You have to trust me on this. You have to tell her that you can type. Just say you can type 60 words per minute. And I was like, okay. And so I'm a terrible, terrible, terrible liar. And, I'm one of those people who you can kind of see my emotions written all over my face. It's very hard for me to keep secrets. I'm just the worst. And I was thinking, I'm not going to be able to do this. Maybe she's not going to ask me if I can type. And I kind of walked to the interview saying, you can type, you can type, you actually can type, you really can type. At the heart of it all, you can type, so that it wouldn't feel like a lie. And then I got to the interview, and of course she did indeed, immediately. The first question she asked me basically was, "Can you type?" And I said, "Yes, I can." And I'm not sure to this day if she actually believed me or not. But once I started, I realized why this question was so important, and it was because this office, as you said, was kind of like the land that time forgot. It's kind of strange, because they represented these great writers of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and like Salinger, 50s and 60s, and it was almost as if, and so that was their heyday. They didn't have any clients who were big contemporary writers at that moment. It was almost as if the agency had kind of stopped progressing in their heyday, or I sometimes thought that it was that they somehow had this idea that if they just held on to all the things that they'd done when they were a big, powerful agency, writing everything by hand and using typewriters and not having voicemail and what have you, then maybe they would go back to being a big, powerful agency somehow by some kind of magical thinking or something. Mm-hmm. But in what this translated to, was this very, very out of touch office. So to sort of make it all clear, my closest friend from high school worked 5 minutes away in a big office tower, the McGraw-Hill building, these kind of iconic midtown buildings. She also worked in publishing. She worked for a textbook publisher, and her office had gone paperless. So there was no paper. They didn't even have a printer on her floor. And everything was done via email. And they weren't supposed to print out any documents unless it was absolutely critical to a project. Whereas my office, 5 minutes away, had just acquired a Xerox machine, and they regarded it as this kind of like fairy tale, object that we had to be really, really, really careful with, and we couldn't make too many copies because we might break it, and if somebody like pushed the wrong buttons and it got stuck, like my boss would, start screaming. I would be like, oh my God, what happened? And of course people have had photocopiers since the 1960s, but this is a very big deal. They had just acquired a fax machine, and they really carefully monitored when you could fax something and when you couldn't and how you did it, and, no computers. Everything was typed on typewriters, no voicemail. It was like if you called, you got the receptionist, and if the receptionist wasn't there, the phone just rang and rang. So this was just completely unheard of at this moment in time. This is the late 90s. Like, everyone had computers, and it was, to me, it was actually charming. I liked it. I liked the kind of retreat from reality in a way. But it wasn't helpful to them in terms of earning money, because publishers had already gone over to sort of doing everything by email and what have you, and they seemed just very out of touch. And they weren't
attractive. Gives you the feeling like it slows life down a little bit by being in an office like that, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, and especially now, nearly 20 years later, if one were to be in an environment like that, there would be something pleasurable about it. This kind of, because now, our devices are so pervasive. Like, I myself am kind of a Luddite. I'm not a person who spends a lot of my day looking at screens. Like, I don't own a tablet. I have a computer. I have an iPhone. That now seems like a necessity, especially because I'm a person who, I travel a lot for work, and I need to talk to my kids and whatever. But I write a lot longhand, and yet those devices still seem so pervasive. In every, TV is everywhere, and so to be in an office, that they didn't even have overhead lights. There were only lamps. It just, I think nowadays, if one were to sort of be in that environment, and the office is still somewhat similar now. It exists today, and they have computers, but in a very minor way. But back then, it still did. There was this feeling of this place kind of being a retreat from the kind of hectic, mercenary, wealth-driven lifestyle of Manhattan. My friends who, even those who, worked in very sleepy industries, everyone's life was just so hectic. And this office, really things operated on a pretty different clock speed than they did the rest of New York,
You have to wonder, too, because we're talking also about, people who write and publish books. And you take a look at the authors, for instance, the one main one we're going to be talking about here in a minute, J.D. Salinger, is that you take a look at their writing and, just taking a look at this office that you're working in here, and it seems to slow things down to a point where maybe there's more thought. There's more of a moment to absorb the energy that's around you. And looking at these authors of the past who wrote great, literary works, where the language was just so broad and beautiful, and some words you don't even see or hear anymore. And you take a look at writing today, and not that it's different, well, it's going to be different, and not that in the past was better, but do you see a difference in the landscape for the kind of writing that's occurring today versus, 30, 40, 60 years ago?
I don't know. I think there's always a breadth of writing happening. So you have more commercial writers, you have your Danielle Steeles and, whatever her name is, who wrote The Devil Wears Prada, Lauren Weisberger, and you have the, Stephen King and, Harry Potter, and you have these kind of more mass market fictions that are, that are much more about story and much less about language. And then on the full other end of the spectrum, you have the sort of hyper-literary works, like sort of French-influenced avant-garde works, that are experiments with language and there's no story at all. And then you have everything in the middle. And you had that 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years ago. There were always people sort of writing in very pedestrian language for the kind of lowest common denominator. And there were always people who were sort of, writing more in kind of an art mode for a very limited audience. And so I think you have the same spectrum now that you would have years back. I mean, except perhaps now there's more because there are more outlets for publishing. There are a ton of small presses. It's much easier to kind of start up a small press nowadays than it was 40 years ago.
These days.
Right. Well, that's a whole different world, and that's not what I mean at all. I mean, I'm talking about like actual publishers. So a small publisher is, really completely different than self-publishing. Like, a small publisher is still, a business entity that has, actual editors who are vetting material that comes in and selecting it and editing it and getting it to be the best that it can be. But often small presses are able to publish things that are perhaps less commercial. They don't need as big a return on their investment because their investment is not as big. They're paying someone $1,000 advance instead of $100,000 advance. So if they sell 500 copies of it or 1,000 copies of it, they're happy, whereas a big publisher would need to sell 30, 40, 50,000 copies to be happy or more. So self-publishing is a whole other realm that I probably don't even want to talk about. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't know that the world, the sort of breadth of material that's out there has changed so much. I just think there's more of it now. There are more titles being produced, and you still have, really interesting literary fiction, maybe even more of it now. Because there are more publishers now. You still have your, he's of course passed away, but you still have your writers like, say, David Foster Wallace or someone like Zadie Smith, or just to name, the super famous versions of a kind of high literary writer. You have, writers of that ilk who are finding, pretty wide audiences. So I don't know that there was some kind of golden age that's now past,
I tend to like to bring, I like to bring that up because, you think of the show Beyond 50, and as people approach midlife, they start looking back to yesteryears when they thought life was so much better. And I think most of the time we think of ourselves as children when we didn't have to go out in the world and worry about it so much. Who knows?
Yeah.
But then how you used to hear your parents say, well, back in my day, as though they're romanticizing the fact that we're in a world today that just doesn't seem to have that flair that their world back then did. But like what you're describing, I see that it's the same, but just in a different way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. It does. I mean, I think sometimes my mother is 84, and I have a sister who's 18 years older than me, so she fits into the demographic of your show. And my mom, I think she sometimes feels so disgruntled with the modern world, in part just because it feels so different than the world in which she was a younger person. It's not that she's romantic for her childhood or anything like that, but just so much has changed, and it just is so baffling to her. And so she kind of sometimes gets sort of irritated by it, kind of.
What does LOL mean anyway?
Or like just annoyed by just typical things like that everyone's looking at their phones all the time, or she's very, I have relatively small kids, and she is really baffled by the ways in which contemporary parents feel that they need to sort of pay so much attention to their kids. Like, she's kind of like, why don't you just let them watch TV? Or why can't they just eat hamburgers? Like, why do they have to eat, like tofu and kombucha? Or, she's very, yes, exactly. Like, oh my God, why do they need, like, why would you spend money feeding them these fancy foods and this kind of thing? Like, it just all seems so alien to her, and presumably when I'm 84, I'll have the same confusion about.
I think so, too. I think we tend to do that, and we get caught up, and then we try to make comparisons when we realize, the world's a little different, but really how we function hasn't changed that much over the years, And it kind of made me wonder, if you were to take the literary greats, such as, the one that's centered here in your book, is that what would they be writing? Would it be the same, do you think, as it was when they were inspired to write it, from the beginning?
You mean if J.D. Salinger were writing today, would he be writing? I have no idea.
See, it's just an interesting thought, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's something that one could answer, because any writer's work or any artist's work is completely rooted in their moment in history. And so Salinger's work is, of course, so much about his experiences during the war and after the war. It's almost the same as saying, like, what would Salinger's work be like if he were, Malaysian? You know what I mean? Like, would it be different? And it's so much a product of the sort of era in which he was raised. I just don't know. I mean, like, if you think about it, he, of course, famously fought World War II, and sort of saw all sorts of, and he was in France and Germany, saw all sorts of, atrocities, and he was, white, Jewish, upper middle class, raised in Manhattan, went to elite private schools, and a person of his demographic, like my father is from a very similar background, and he was, enlisted during the Korean War, as did all his friends. But today, the kids, in Iraq and Afghanistan, are a completely different demographic. So, you're not necessarily, it would be very unusual to have someone, like a sort of wealthy kid from the Upper East Side enlist, and who went to private schools, enlist and go off to Iraq. It happens, but it's very unusual, and so so it's just impossible to say what if he were around today, what would his work be like? It might be very different, because he wouldn't have sort of been in the military and witnessed horror,
Right. It's sort of like that comparison you tend to hear a lot from sports enthusiasts, for instance, if you like boxing. What would it be like if Muhammad Ali and, I'm trying to remember his name now, Rocky Marciano fought? I mean, this was something that even went so far, they actually created a computer-generated fight based on all the statistics of all their fights. They threw them in the ring as a computer-generated boxing match, to see who would actually win. But the fact is, you could never really know, because maybe that guy is having a bad day that day. and so I can see clearly what you're talking about here. Interestingly enough, you started to, I guess, learn about J.D. Salinger through fan mail. Is that how that worked?
I mean, sort of, yes.
Okay.
So for listeners, so this part of the plot of this book, which is a memoir, so plot makes it sound a little bit like it's fiction, but it's not. So part of the story of the book is I took this job. I was not from a world or a family that was involved in the literary universe of New York. So, which is a very sort of like rarefied, high culture kind of glamour industry in New York. A lot of the people who take jobs as assistants in the publishing industry are from pretty wealthy families. You've gone to prep school and what have you, because the salaries are so low that it's very hard to survive on them. So they tend to often be people who have a private, income, who have a trust fund or something to help them live on it.
Something to do on the side.
Yes. And so I was, it was traditionally a kind of gentleman's industry. So I was not from that kind of family, and I took this job, as I said, not even knowing what a literary agency was, but not knowing, this is before, Google existed. So if I were to go on an interview for this job now, I would Google the name of the agency, but that didn't exist then, so I couldn't do that. And so I went on this interview, and I did not know anything about the agency, and it was only my sort of first day or so on the job that I discovered that Salinger was their most famous client. They also represented F. Scott Fitzgerald and Langston Hughes and a lot of other great writers, but Salinger is by far their most well-known client. And and this may be part of the reason that I got the job, honestly. I was not a Salinger fan, so I had just dropped out of a doctoral program in English, and I had thought of myself as, a sort of academic type of person and intellectual. I took myself very seriously as a young intellectual, and I was interested in, I was obsessed with fiction and still am, and all I did was read and write. But I was interested in what I thought of as more sort of kind of gritty urban fiction, and I thought of Salinger, who's one of the most popular writers of all time. His work's been published in every language, millions and millions and millions, tens of millions of copies of all his books have been sold. So I thought, Salinger is so popular. I'd somehow not read him. I hadn't had to read him in high school or college. As I said, my sister is almost 20 years older than I am, so it wasn't a situation where, like, your older brother or sister was like, you got to read The Catcher in the Rye. No one said that to me. I somehow just never read him. And so I didn't go into the interview and say, oh, my God, I love Salinger. I can't wait to work here, as I think other applicants may have. And I found out after I got the job that he was a client, as I said. And a month or so later, and I never told anyone that I hadn't read any Salinger because it just didn't come up, but it also just seemed like it would be strange. And I was very shy, and I didn't want to make a big deal about anything at all. So a month or so into the job, one of my coworkers, a person who's kind of like the curator of this old agency, who kind of knew the whole history of it, walked over to my desk and dumped a pile of letters on it and said, oh, by the way, these are the Salinger letters. You need to answer them. And I said, what? What do you mean? He said, letters from Salinger's fans. So Salinger doesn't want to see his fan mail, so we have to answer it for him. And I said, oh, okay, so I can just write whatever I want? And he said, no, and sort of almost had a stroke in front of my desk and, said, no, there's a form letter. You have to follow this form letter. I'll get it for you. Walked over to his desk, came back and handed me a sheet of kind of crumbling yellow paper that had a letter on it. The date on the letter was 1963, and it said, "Dear, sir or madam, thank you for your kind letter to J.D. Salinger. As you may know, Mr. Salinger does not wish to receive mail from his readers. Thus, we cannot pass on your letter to him. We're sure you understand. Now, please go away. Do not ever call or write or bother us in any way, shape, or form ever again. Do not follow up on this letter. We are not going to respond." So it was like this very, 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 very firm, grim, unfriendly letter. And so I was charged with typing this letter over and over and over and over again, just customizing the kind of name and address at the top. And I signed it with my own name. And so the letters to Salinger were incredibly detailed and almost like short stories in and of themselves. Not all of them. Some of them were more typical, like, "Dear Mr. Salinger, your books have changed my life. I love you. Here's a photo of my dog," or whatever. Or, "I'd love it if you would write back." But a lot of them were these just kind of heart-rending tales of loss and grief, or finding lost love, or everything, every sort of human story you can imagine. There were a lot from teenagers that were kind of written in the voice of Holden Caulfield. So for listeners who have not read The Catcher in the Rye in a very long time, the Catcher in the Rye is written in this very distinctive style. It's a first-person narrative, and Holden Caulfield sort of begins by saying, if you really want to hear about it, if you really want to hear the story of my life, and what have you, and all that David Copperfield stuff, you're going to have to listen. And so there was all of these letters that were kind of very Holden Caulfield-esque. They would be like, "Dear Jerry, you old bastard, my crumb bun Steve and I were reading The Catcher in the Rye the other day, and we said, this is the best goddamn book I've ever read," and
which is pretty much the language he uses in the book.
Yes, exactly, and they were hilarious, but they were also heartbreaking, and it was so they were letters that weren't just tossed off. A lot of thought had gone into them, and it was very, very hard for me to just send this form letter back. But the thing is that a lot of them contained a lot of plot of the books. And I became so interested in Salinger, partly just from reading about the plot of the stories and thinking, people would write and say, "So in Franny and Zoe, is Franny pregnant? Is that why she faints?" And I would think, who is Franny? And, is she pregnant? I don't know. I want to know. But I also, and there were a lot of letters that were like, "So the ducks in Central Park, where do they go?" And I was like, what is all this stuff about ducks? And
starting to feel like you were actually missing something there on Facebook, huh?
Yes, I suppose. Yes, many years before Facebook.
They're liking all this, but I don't get it. I've got to go and read that book, so they become your own, best promoter, so to speak.
I suppose, and but I just also began to see the ways in which Salinger had profoundly affected so many people's lives. If not defined their lives. People talked about reading his books over and over and over again at pivotal moments in their lives, and it made me really rethink Salinger and see his work differently. And then at the same time, I started talking to him on the phone, and he was this incredibly kind, lovely person, and I became pretty curious about his work.
Now, were you able to talk with him and get to know him as best as you could, given the situation?
I was, yeah. I feel like it might be like the tiniest exaggeration to say I got to know him, but I guess I suppose I did to the extent that one could, in that situation, as you said. So basically another sort of storyline in the book has to do with Salinger deciding to publish a new book. So Salinger published his last story in the 60s. It's called Hapworth 16, 1929, and it's a story never collected in book form. It was published in the New Yorker, who exclusively were publishing his work in the 60s. And he basically, who knows what happened. Some people think he just stopped writing after that. Some people think he continued writing, but he just didn't want to publish anymore because he felt kind of inexplicably betrayed or burned by the publishing industry, that they were just all commercial and phonies and what have you. And so he had this story, which is part of, he has a cycle of stories about a family called the Glass family, and that I just love, and many people are sort of obsessed with these stories. And this particular story is a letter home from camp, written by Salinger, but ostensibly written by one of the Glass family characters, the eldest child in the Glass family, named Seymour Glass, who's this child genius, a sort of troubled genius. And he, of course, as many people know, famously takes his life in one of Salinger's most loved stories, A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. Mm-hmm. So this story looks at Seymour as a child, and it's largely considered Salinger's worst story. It's 60 pages long. It took up a whole issue of The New Yorker, really a whole issue. And it's meandering. There's a whole section of it that's just, a list of books that Seymour wants his parents to send, a huge, huge, huge long list. And some people love the story and think it's like a sort of piece of modern genius, but many people really feel disappointed by it or are annoyed by it. So it turns out that about 8 years before I started working at this agency, a tiny press in Virginia, the publisher of a tiny press, a one-man operation, had written to Salinger and said, I would like to publish Hapworth 16 as a standalone book. It's your only story that has not been collected in book form. It's long enough to be a book. And Salinger, I guess, mulled it over for 8 years, and then the day that I started work, called my boss and said, I want to do this. And so I had been told that I would have no contact with Salinger. And my boss took me into her office on my second day and said, some people take this job, they think that Salinger is going to become their best friend, that they're going to be on the phone with him all the time, that they're going to be sending him their novel or whatever. That's not going to happen. He's not going to call, and if he does call, the receptionist is going to put him through directly to me. And if by some chance he does get put through to you, you just say, yes, Mr. Salinger, I will get my boss. You don't say a word to him. And and I said, okay. But lo and behold, he called the day after I started, and then he was calling all the time because he was he was excited about this new project, and he became very close with the publisher, and it became a sort of huge thing in his life. It seemed like for this brief moment, it was kind of at the center of his work life. So I ended up talking to him quite frequently, and he was, I was, of course, very, very nervous at first, the first time I had to speak to him. But I got past it a little because he was, incredibly kind and warm and lovely and did everything he could. He seemed to sense that an assistant would be nervous talking to him, and he did everything he could to mitigate it. Mm-hmm.
Sounds like quite an experience for you.
It was. It definitely was. I think everyone's first job really defines them in a way. I've had people say to me, I loved your book. It reminded me so much of my first job working at a salmon canning factory in Minnesota, and things like that. And I thought, really? Wow. And I think that it's because there's something about your first job where you just, you kind of become an adult suddenly, no matter what your upbringing. It doesn't matter if, you were raised in an orphanage. Suddenly, somehow, you have to kind of be on your own and make your own way and figure things out for yourself.
Especially when it comes to matters of the heart like your college boyfriend, Don.
Oh, yeah. Well, my college boyfriend was actually a different
I got that a little confused, but I was remembering that part of the book where, first of all, he's written this story about the Swedish blonde gal, and then you come to find out it was actually, and I kind of suspected that it was his actual life experience, and then there was the letter that you found that was addressed to somebody or for somebody else, and you thought it was for you that you found in a book, and you're thinking,
yeah,
boy, and these are the kind of crazy things, that actually go on in your young adult years, the uncertainty of relationships, the uncertainty of the future, just a lot going on there, and you kind of look back and think, how did we ever get through all that?
I know, it's so true. I know, I would sometimes go to work and be in such turmoil. And then years later, many years later, I was the editor of a magazine, and I had my own assistants and interns, who were 23 and 24, and sometimes they would come to work and they would look just exhausted, and you could tell that something was wrong in that way, or they would be wearing the same clothes they had on the day before, and you just knew that they were sort of going through this kind of, turmoil that you go through in these kind of post-adolescent years. But yeah, for listeners, another storyline in the book is that I have this sort of horrible boyfriend, this kind of nightmare boyfriend, who's the boyfriend that, like, I think a lot of women have to get out of their system.
Right, the bad boy that you're trying to change.
The bad boy. Exactly.
You know, you'd be interested to know this, too, Joanna, is that over the years, as I've talked with publicists, it's funny how from time to time you get off track and you build sort of a relationship that you can over the telephone, but that you begin to hear personal stories, and I hear that a lot. It seemed funny, like, is this just really unique to the publishing world for women? You know, that they're finding these bad boy boyfriends, you know, and then all of a sudden they realize that's not for me, and they find the good guy finally. It seemed kind of funny, actually.
Yeah, I don't think it. I mean, I think it's honestly worse in the kind of music world.
Well, I'm sure of that.
That's where I see it. But I do think that there is a type of woman. I know many of them, having gone to Oberlin and just like generally being an artsy kind of world where you have this idea that someone who is, you know, really kind and stable somehow has to be boring, and that someone with whom you have a lot of conflict, you know, who makes you feel like you're really special for him having chosen you because he's sort of looking at other people or what have you. It seems like somehow like that's more, you have this idea based on kind of novels and movies that that's what love has to be, that it has to be sort of difficult and filled with conflict. And then as you get older, you realize that no, it actually doesn't. Like, someone can actually be nice to you.
Right. Well, you know, think about, like, you see these shows on television, for instance, The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, okay? And I find it funny how Disneyland-like they try to make this when eventually she bequeaths her love to the one guy that's finally won it after 25 other guys, for instance. And that they want this, but yet you're out there in the world and you see, and this really pertains to a lot of times women in their 20s and maybe their 30s. I think by the 30s they start not putting up with it as much, but the fact that they go, you know, I really want that, but I've got a guy that's giving it to me and I'm just bored off my socks. I'd rather have this guy that's going to leave me a nervous, emotional wreck day in and day out until they just can't tolerate it anymore and they realize, well, geez, now I see what I've lost over here. But yet, according to television, that's what they want. You know, and it's such a weird paradox sometimes.
Yeah.
And you got through it by becoming a writer.
I suppose, yes. Yeah, well, I did. I think for me, you know, I was really enamored of some idea of a kind of literary world, and I had this college boyfriend whom I loved very much, and who was and is a composer and was very much in the kind of classical music world, which, you know, was not my world, you know, and it wasn't, he didn't even love it so much either, but it just felt a bit boring, and I had this idea that there was a kind of whole, like, Bloomsbury Circle or, like, Dorothy Parker or something world out there that I wanted to be part of. And so this particular boyfriend who I met afterwards, you know, fancied himself a writer. He really modeled himself on Norman Mailer, you know, right down to the fact that he boxed. And, you know, it seemed like he sort of fit a certain idea that I had about what a kind of writerly, angry young man would be, or something. I felt that he took writing and literature very, very seriously, and I suppose the good thing about him was that he enabled me to take myself seriously as a writer, because he took himself so seriously, and he took me seriously too, as a writer. He was very competitive with me, and so there's a way in which he kind of really did actually help me, despite his total jerkiness, helped me figure out that I really was going to be a writer, that I wasn't going to sort of retreat into kind of staying with this agency and becoming an agent, or in other ways just kind of settling into a safer profession or world. So I'm grateful to him for that.
Mm-hmm.
He was kind of a catalyst.
We have a lot of people who listen, and some of the things that we talk about here is you get to a stage in life that you may want to consider writing a memoir, sort of a mark that leaves behind your experience in life and shares with others, basically your story. What would you say to people like that? First of all, what they should do to get started, and what would you define success in writing to be?
God, I mean, there are many, many different types of success to sort of answer this question backward. Backwards. I mean, one type of success is simply, and I'm speaking, personally for me, is simply like sitting down and having a day in which I like having a good writing day, writing a good sentence or paragraph or page. Or having a story fall into place, or plot lines fall into place, or something structural fall into place. Another way of defining success is having that day over and over and over again, just like sitting down in your chair every day and working. And then there's, of course, sort of pragmatic, real-world success in which you sell a book and you are professionally a writer, and that is what you do, and you're lucky enough to get to do that every day, and that's your job. And so, there are different types of success along the way. So there's publishing success, and there's writing success. And, I guess I would say about writing a memoir, I think the sort of biggest mistake that people make with memoir, and the hardest thing about memoir, is thinking that a memoir is kind of a life, like the story of your life, or the kind of trajectory of your life. And at this point in time, a memoir used to be something like that. Like a memoir used to be like a kind of grand man or grand woman, Winston Churchill or whoever, sitting down and writing their life story. Like, I was born, in Chesterfield and what have you. But memoir in this day and age is not that. It's something quite different. And it usually is, a kind of defined a story with a defined plot line that's often very focused on a particular idea or a moment in a person's life, or a string of moments, or one thing, a sort of central moment. Right now I'm reading a really wonderful memoir by the New Yorker writer Rebecca Mead called My Life in Middlemarch, that in some ways is very similar to my own, in some ways very different, but it's about her sort of reading George Eliot's Middlemarch as a young person, and the ways in which she kind of revisits that book over her life. But it also is very much about George Eliot's life and her own life and all, so in some ways it's just kind of about her very kind of normal extraordinary life, and George Eliot's normal extraordinary life, and it's lovely. So I guess the thing that I would say is that if you're going to sit down to write a memoir, there are two different possibilities. Like, one is to think about why you're writing this before you even get started. Are you writing this purely because you want to write and you feel this kind of intense, burning desire and passion and need to write a particular story? Are you writing it because you want a sort of record of your life for your family? Because those are two very different things. So if you are writing this because you're a writer at heart, and this is something that you want to publish and get out there, then I would say the first step would be to read as much as possible and think about, like, what is your story, honing it down. What is your entry point? What is your perspective? Your sort of are you writing this from the perspective of today, or are you, as in my novel, placing yourself in the past and kind of having the reader go through that moment in the past with you closely? Anyway, I guess all I'm saying is that writing is a big endeavor, and if you're just doing it for your own pleasure, then just do it. If you're doing it for larger reasons, if you have larger ambitions, then do a lot of thinking and reading, before you get started or as you get started.
Very good words. In fact, I just did a segment before yours, and it's a memoir called The Big Tiny, a built-it-myself memoir.
Wow.
And it's actually about a woman who built an 84-square-foot home.
Wow.
Yeah, 84 square feet. and she's been living in it over 10 years now, and talked about why she decided to go in that direction with her life. It was about sustainability, and how she had visited, in Guatemala and realized the poverty that was going on down there, and said, maybe I can decide to scale down too, and so that's what she did. So that's sort of what you're talking about, more of the plot-oriented kind of a memoir.
Yeah, exactly. Like that, from my perspective, there are memoirs that I love. Like one of my favorite memoirs is by a writer named Claire Dederer, and it's called Poser. And in a way, that book is kind of her life story, but filtered through one particular idea. But for the most part, a lot of the memoirs that I love are more focused.
Right.
And they read like novels. They have a kind of arc to them, a story arc, and that was very much my goal. I am really a fiction writer, and so that was very much my goal as a memoirist, to kind of write a memoir that read like a novel.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you certainly achieved that, and I'll be excited to finish because, it's just kind of one of those you get in and you realize there's a bit of you in there as well, that you've experienced some of the things that you have, and I'm talking about me personally, that first job and, the trials and tribulations, what is the future bringing to me, how do I participate, how do I have the confidence to take that next step, where does all this go, all those questions we tend to ask ourselves in life.
Yeah, yes.
Is there a website people can find out more about your work?
Yes, I have a website. It's just my name, Joanna Rakoff. I'm also on Facebook. You can find me on Facebook, and that's sort of updated more frequently than my website because I'm lazy. And I'm also on Twitter.
I know what you mean. Technology can just work you to death for a lot of things that sometimes just don't matter as much.
Yes, exactly. Something has to go. And
time to get back to that dictaphone, I think.
Yes, it's waiting for me.
It's funny when you brought that up because I still don't remember ever seeing one of those.
Well, lucky you.
Yeah, lucky me. Well, Joanna, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. And the book is My Salinger Year, and I know that people will enjoy this very, very much. Just kind of give you a wake-up call about, especially what the literary world is like and getting that first job and what that's like to live during those times.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
You bet. You can find out more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Also, we encourage you to subscribe to our exclusive e-news updates. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.